Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Gomes with Job Service Kalispell. Thank you for joining us this May to attend Blueprint for Business Success's fifth and final seminar in the 2021 Spring Series. Please take a moment to help us identify the businesses benefiting from today's seminar. Enter your name, title, business you represent, and your city in the chat box. Attendees are muted, but we encourage you to use the chat box for asking questions, which will be answered at the end of the presentation as time allows. As usual, we ask that your questions and comments are polite and respectful to all attendees and the presenter. There is a 2-minute anonymous survey that we would appreciate you completing. It will pop up when you click on Leave at the end of the seminar. Your feedback helps us improve the program and offer future topics and content that is useful to Montana businesses. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Officer Dennis Bain as he shares information on preventing violence in the workplace. Officer Bain is a Flathead Valley native and graduate of Flathead High School. He attended Flathead Valley Community College and earned an associate degree in engineering. He spent 12 years as a member of the Montana Army National Guard, including a tour in Iraq. Officer Bain has been serving with Kalispell Police Department since 2011. He is an active member of the Kalispell Police Department Special Response Team, a field training officer, and an instructor in defensive tactics, use of force, and run, lock, fight intruder training. This seminar will focus on preventing violence between employees as well as avoiding conflict between employees and customers. Officer Bain will address best practices for de-escalating situations and different methods of handling loss prevention and theft. He will also touch on the topic of masks and how law enforcement can assist businesses who require employees and customers to wear them. Please welcome Officer Dennis Bain.
All right, thank you. So maybe. All right, so here's a quick outline. We've already kind of discussed my bio, which I appreciate. I will add to that prior to being a police officer, I worked in a number of different customer service and sales related jobs. So that has kind of helped with my experience in this subject. We'll go over some statistics, talk about the types and levels of workplace violence, some possible warning signs, tips for prevention, resolving customer conflicts, preventing what I call external violence, some loss prevention tips, more information specifically on background checks, mask enforcement, and then our Q&A. So what we're talking about here is the level of conflict is more than just a disagreement. Like when my wife and I are trying to figure out where to go eat dinner. This is more of a threat, whether or not it's meant that way, but one or both parties perceives it as such. It can fester if it's ignored and until it is resolved. Sometimes it's not based on objective facts. It's life experience, values, beliefs. It can trigger strong emotions, which requires individuals to be comfortable with and managing their own emotions. But it also creates opportunities for growth. It can build trust and security when challenges are safely resolved. So here's some statistics. According to OSHA, there are an estimated 2 million cases of violence in the workplace every year. This includes everything from verbal altercations to actual physical violence and, unfortunately, homicides. 1 in 7 workers doesn't feel safe at their workplace. Last year in 2020, there was 30% of employees stated that they are unaware of their company's safety plan, which includes workplace violence, but also medical emergencies and even just power outages. Workplace violence costs an estimated $120 billion annually. This includes lost wages, medical costs, lawsuits, and legal fees. An estimated 25% of incidents go unreported. I don't understand that statistic. If it's unreported, how do they put a number on it? 94% of employees state that they have been bullied in their workplace at some degree and at some point. And 50% of workplace violence reports come from healthcare workers. And it's especially high among emergency room doctors and nurses. There are 4 types of workplace violence. The first is external. This is where the perpetrator is a stranger. This would be like a burglar, cases of robbery, thefts, shopliftings, things like that. The second type would be customer violence, where the perpetrator is a business associate or a customer that becomes violent. Third is coworker violence, kind of self-explanatory. One employee assaults another. And the fourth is domestic, where the perpetrator is not part of the business, but is somehow related to an employee, such as a spouse, relative, etc. U.S. Department of Labor categorizes 3 levels of workplace violence and different responses for that. So level 1 would be the early warning signs. An employee that is verbally abusive or bullying to other employees. They are uncooperative, disrespectful to other staff members or to customers. They use intimidation to get what they want. Maybe they're the office bully. Nobody will stand up to them, so they always get their way. And there might be instances of stalking other employees outside of the workplace. So the response to that would be, first, once you observe the behavior, you're going to report it to their supervisor if you aren't already the supervisor. You always want to document the behavior. I'm one of our field training officers, and I can't stress documentation enough. We document everything with our new officers, any remedial training that we have, and it doesn't even have to be violence or anything like this. Anytime we have to retrain the officer for anything, driving behavior, down to even just report writing, we constantly document those things so that down the road, unfortunately, if we do have to let somebody go, it is documented if they try to come back with some sort of wrongful termination suit or something. So once the behavior is documented, the supervisor wants to meet with the employee and discuss the concerns. Some of the things you're going to keep in mind with this: do it in a private time and place. We're not going to do it out in the open where everybody sees what's going on. Coordinate any union participation if you have a union rep, depending on the size of your business, and get straight to the point. Figure out, ask the employee for their input. Tell them what they've done wrong, ask for their input, and ask them, what do you think should be done about this kind of behavior? And ask how you as the supervisor can help. So you're going to identify those areas of concern, identify the steps for corrective action, set limits on what is acceptable and not, and establish some timeframes and subsequent consequences if those timeframes aren't met. And again, you can reiterate department policies. Level 2 would be escalation. This is an employee that has started, they argue with staff, argue with customers, vendors. They refuse to obey policies and procedures for the business. Maybe they damage or even steal property as a revenge. And they verbalize violence against coworkers and or management. So obviously this has a slightly different response. Again, you're going to notify the supervisor and call 911 if you think it's warranted. Secure your safety and the safety of others. If they verbalize some violence against other parties involved, make sure that those people, those employees know about the violence so they can take steps to protect themselves. Again, document the behavior. And the supervisor, again, you're going to meet with that employee to discuss the concerns. At this point, though, like I said, things have escalated. You might want to call for some assistance, whether that's law enforcement or just other managers. You want to, again, avoid an audience when you're dealing with this employee. You're going to remain calm. You're going to speak slowly, softly, and clearly to that person. Ask them to sit down if they can follow directions. Again, they might be in a bit of a rage. And ask them relevant questions. Ask them why they're in such a rage, what they can do to regain control of themselves, what you could do to help them try to regain some control, and try to redirect that behavior. Lastly would be level 3, which is an emergency response. This would be an employee that is making suicidal threats. That needs to be addressed right away. If there is physical violence in the workplace, if there's a use of weapons at all, and again, any display of extreme rage. Again, the proper response is to call 911 and let law enforcement take over upon our arrival. Again, notify the supervisor, secure your safety and the safety of others, and cooperate with law enforcement when we get there. By that, what I mean is we might need to get written statements from you or from other witnesses as to what was said by the employee, video, if there's any internal video of the violence, if there was a physical fight, we would need those kinds of things, and that would help us move forward with our case. So here's some potential warning signs to keep an eye out for. Excessive drug and or alcohol use, unexplained absenteeism, depression, suicidal comments, continual violation of company policies, and any kind of behavioral changes like mood swings, paranoia. Also, a decline in job performance or just very inconsistent. Sometimes you have a pretty high operating employee and all of a sudden, yeah, everybody has a bad day. But if their productivity or their performance is just all over the place, that could be a sign of something going on. Threats, whether they're direct threats or veiled threats. Direct threat like, hey, the next time I see him, I'm going to punch him in the nose, versus a veiled threat like he better watch his back. Things like that need to be taken seriously. An employee that blows simple things out of proportion, ran out of coffee or something like that, and they throw a huge fit that's out of character for them. Intimidation of other employees or customers. Again, that intimidation, if they're using that to bully, and that's out of character. Verbalizing revenge. If they get crossed by a coworker and they say, hey, he's going to get his someday. Those are things to keep in mind. A decrease in their health or in their hygiene. Any of these things, they aren't just automatic indicators of potential violence. But what it is, you should take these as some red flags to monitor, especially if they're out of character for your employees. It's something that you might want to start digging deeper. Prevention. So let's talk about that. Prevention begins with the hiring process. Background checks on prospective employees can help shed some light on any potential issues and avoid problems down the road. And I'll touch on background checks after a bit. Check references. You ask for references, so check them, because a lot of times that can be a pretty good insight into their work history, personal life, things like that. So use those. You want to have a policy that prevents harassment. This kind of sounds basic, but what I mean by that is harassment and bullying can create an offensive and intimidating work environment, and that can be an indicator for possible violence. So your policy should have procedures in place to address any complaints efficiently and ensure that all employees are aware of it and they understand it. This should include a specific definition of harassment, how they can report it, and how complaints are going to be investigated, and lay out the consequences for any violations. There should be a strict anti-violence policy in place. This leaves no room for questions with managers as to how, consistency with violators should be treated. Again, make sure that all of your employees know the consequences. And these policies, they can be very empowering for the rest of your employees because they know that they're protected by management, and that helps establish a trust between your employees and your managers, because they know that their concerns are going to be listened to and that there's not going to be any retaliation against them for reporting any violence. Have an open line of communication with management and HR for grievances. I understand not everybody is a huge corporation. You might have a small business where you are the manager, you're the owner, you're HR, you're the CFO, you're the CEO, you're everything. So there may not be departments to go to, but you need to have an open line of communication with your employees so that they feel comfortable coming to you with any of these concerns. How to prevent conflicts from turning into violence. Layoffs and firings can be pretty tense situations. To prevent this from turning violent, you can alert staff and security if you have it as soon as it occurs, so they can be on the lookout. In my 10 years at KPD, when we've unfortunately have had to let some officers go, some were senior tenured officers and others were still on a probationary status, but we were always notified immediately if that had happened, so we could keep an eye out for officers and we knew whether or not they were supposed to be in the building. You can also request some extra patrols from law enforcement during this time, and I'll touch on that a little bit as well. Manage and monitor visitors. And again, this will be dependent on your type of business. If you're a retail location, you obviously encourage visitors. That's your customer base. But if it's something like the police department, the hospital, schools, things like that, what policies, what procedures do you have in place for visitors? Do they have a check-in desk? Do they wear a visitor badge? Are they escorted during their time at the business? At the police department, even whether it's FedEx, UPS, it's the guy filling the Coke machine. As soon as they walk in, they have an escort until their business is concluded. They're not allowed to just wander around. It's that way at the sheriff's office. It's that way at the hospital, schools. I was a resource officer for 3 years, and schools definitely take the visitors into consideration. So we don't just have people wandering around. Next, identify some organizational risk factors. And what I mean by that is these can be personal situations that get brought to work. Maybe you have an employee that's having some financial difficulties, marital issues, other stressors at home. Again, like I talked about before, that open line of communication with management, your employee should be comfortable enough to tell you, hey, I just broke up with my boyfriend, girlfriend. I just filed for divorce. I have a restraining order against my spouse due to something. So they're not to be here. They're not to contact me, things like that. So being able to identify those risk factors ahead of time to keep an eye out for those people. That open line of communication, again, will make sure that they feel safe in confiding that to you. Offer counseling services. If you have an employee assistance program, maybe you've got some job counseling and resources available if somebody's going to be laid off or fired. Kind of a personal story. My father-in-law worked at the aluminum plant for 30 some years. And when it went under, one of the things that they did, in my opinion, did well was they offered retraining, schooling, and those types of things to their employees. So it was a little bit easier. They kind of had a plan B, if you will. And that might help mitigate some of the issues. Lastly, training. Train your managers, train your supervisors on how to recognize some of these signs before it reaches a boiling point. Train them on conflict resolution and negotiation skills. I know FECC up at the college, they have a great resource. They offer continuing education, non-credit classes for career and business development. That might be something to look at as well. Let's talk about active listening. When we're dealing with these types of conflicts, listen with the intent to understand, not with the intent just to formulate your response. If you're just listening long enough to figure out what you're going to say and counter this person, you're going to miss what is being said. Like I said here, there's a difference between listening and hearing. Ask my 7-year-old. She's a pretty good example of that. As you're talking to this person and trying to relay back and forth, validate what they're saying. Okay, I understand why you're upset, because paraphrase what they've said and restate it back to them. I understand you're upset because you didn't get promoted on this last round of promotions. It allows them to clarify, and it shows that you're listening. It also forces them to listen to you because they want to listen and make sure you heard what they said. So it's kind of a two-way street. It forces them to listen to you and not just hear what you're saying. De-escalation. De-escalation is a behavior that is intended to escape the escalations of conflict. It's a philosophy. It's not just a specific process or tactic. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Two of the methods that you can use would be your use of voice and your body posture and position. Use of your voice, the tone of what's being said, the volume at which you say it, your rate of speech, and your inflection of voice. And we'll break those down. Your tone of voice, you want to speak slowly, as this is usually interpreted as soothing. You want to be respectful, use please and thank you, as well as Mr. or Ms., sir, especially if you don't know the person. If it's an employee and you're on a first name basis, you can probably skip the formalities. But if it's a customer that has an issue, you want to show that respect. You want to use a controlled voice, because it shows that you're calm and confident. A raised voice can show anticipation or uncertainty, and that can delay the process. If everybody's on edge, you're not going to get anywhere. Use humor pretty sparingly, as it may unintentionally offend the person and escalate the situation. If you are going to try to use humor, maybe direct it towards yourself. I used to work at a mail order supplement company based out of Whitefish. We also sold clothing for cycling, triathlons, things like that. If somebody, an example would be somebody calls up because they ordered a cycling jersey. Yeah, I ordered a large. I guess I need an extra large. Probably don't want to make a comment about maybe they should work out harder. They'd fit into the large, things like that. So be careful when you're using humor. Let's talk about inflection of voice. How you say things can be just as important as what you're saying. So the phrase, I didn't say you were stupid. If you phrase it as, I didn't say you were stupid, but I'm definitely thinking it, right? I didn't say you were stupid, my manager did. Or I didn't say you were stupid, I said you were a complete moron. So you want to be very careful with that inflection, because that can affect how they interpret what it is you're trying to say. Let's talk about body language as well. You look at some of these pictures, for example, she's standing with her hands on her hips. She looks a little bit annoyed. The guy in the bottom corner is checking his watch. He wonders when it's going to be lunch. How much longer are you going to ramble on? The two people in the middle, they're attentive. They're paying attention. Crossing of the arms, this one kind of goes both ways. For me, that's just a comfortable way of standing. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm disinterested or annoyed, but you want to try to be careful with that one. It's estimated that 80 to 90% of our communication is nonverbal. You want to avoid encroaching on their personal space. People have a very specific distance what they're comfortable with. So you want to avoid getting into their personal bubble. That can heighten their anxiety, but it also helps protect you. You kind of stay out of their kicking distance, if you will. You don't want to touch a hostile person. They can interpret that as an aggressive act. If you try to put your hand on their shoulder and, hey, let's step into my office, they might interpret that as an act of aggression. So be very careful about trying to touch them. Your words can be trying to de-escalate, but your body language isn't. If you're pointing your finger, that can seem accusing or threatening. Shrugging your shoulders, you might seem uncaring or unknowing. Fake smiles can aggravate the situation. We've all had that situation where you can tell somebody is just patronizing you. A hard stare can be taken as threatening. You may intend to just be intent on what they're saying, but it looks like you're trying to stare them down. Be careful with eye rolls. My wife will often tell me to be careful that my face is talking because I will do things like that. I'll roll my eyes, things like that. So you've got to be careful and realize that your nonverbal clues are just as important as your verbal clues. The flip side of this is to recognize the other person's nonverbal clues as well. If they're clenching their fists, they're pacing, if they square up toe to toe, for example, they really get in your face, that might be the time to ask for some assistance because this person is definitely escalating. Let's talk about resolving customer conflicts. First of all, stay calm. I use the soup Nazi. I don't know if that's politically correct anymore, but we'll go with it. So stay calm. Getting snarky with somebody or yelling is not going to help the situation. If you're just trying to outshout each other, you're not going to get anywhere. This is something I use a lot in police work. We get to a scene of a disturbance, and everybody's just trying to outshout each other. And I'll talk even quieter than I am now when I'm addressing the person, and quickly they realize that they're the only one yelling and they kind of look ridiculous. So they will start lowering their volume so that they don't look like the one shouting. Address the situation promptly, especially if it was a complaint that came through a voicemail or an email. The longer you wait, the harder it's going to be to try and resolve. Plus, if you offer up a prompt solution, it shows that you and your company care. So ask some key questions and listen for the answers. I talked about listening versus hearing. Why are they upset? What can you do to help remedy the situation? Sometimes people just want to vent. Don't interrupt them. Wait for them to finish, and then you can ask those pertinent questions to try and get a better idea of what it is that they're seeking. Apologize and own up to your mistakes, whether it's yours or your company's. Again, the supplement company that I used to work for, we used to sell gel packets for energy. And unfortunately, sometimes it would get shipped across the country and they would explode. So you would get a call from an upset customer that they had chocolate gel all over the inside of their large jersey or whatever. So obviously you want to apologize for that. Maybe it was packed improperly. Maybe the shipping company drop kicked it, whatever happened. But you want to own up to the mistake and work to make it right. Decide how much you're willing to give and then negotiate. Is being right worth losing somebody's business? Again, the situation with the exploded gel packet, it was pretty easy. Yeah, apologize, send them some new product, make sure it's packed carefully. That was usually enough to appease them. That's what they wanted. It was the product they ordered. And I would usually, back in that time, I would ship it out 2-day. That way it got there quick, and it usually was enough to help get repeat customers. So you want to try and negotiate and find that resolution. What's going to make them happy, and what's also going to help with your bottom line. Break the news gently if they are at fault. And here's what I mean by that. You reiterate what they said. So you told me that the shirt that you bought, it shrunk when you washed it. Well, you see on the tag, it said dry clean only. So, unfortunately, there's not much, I can't send you a new shirt, but maybe you can offer them a discount on the next one. Right before I got into police work, I worked at a specialty masonry and fireplace store. We installed a big, beautiful fireplace in this woman's new home, state of the art, supposed to heat the whole house. We got a call from her a couple days in, said that she's just constantly putting wood in this thing, just won't stay hot. All she does is just monitor this fire. This thing's a piece of junk, come rip it out of the wall. So instead, what we did is we went out, one of our service techs went out and realized what she was doing was she was trying to heat her house with newspaper and kindling. And she couldn't figure out why she was having to feed this fire every 20 minutes. So we broke the news to her gently. Again, I didn't say you were an idiot. What we did was we explained it to her and broke it down. No, that's how you start it. And then you put the large logs on. And then she called us a couple of days later, wanted us to know how to turn the thing down because it was too hot. So that's the type of customer service thing that you can offer up without making them look stupid, but offer them some, it's your fault, but we can fix it, right? Step away or get a supervisor or even law enforcement if it becomes hostile or threatening. They're using profanity, they're posturing, making threats. Just ask them, do you want to continue this meeting calmly, or do you want to stop now and continue tomorrow? Try to give them an out. Then they kind of realize that they need to either de-escalate, they need to calm down, or the conversation is over. And finally, end on a good note. Thank them for their business. Try to encourage them. And even like the supplement company, we would usually check in a week later. Hey, I want to make sure that other order showed up, that everything show up okay. And almost always it generated repeat orders. So let's talk about post-incident steps. What can be done after an escalated incident? You can trespass the offender, whether it's an employee or a customer. A simple trespass just keeps them off of your property. It does need to be filed with law enforcement or dispatch. What I mean by that, we get called numerous times here recently with different hotels. A guest gets unruly, they want them kicked out. So we show up and it's registered with our dispatch. Hey, Joe Schmo is no longer allowed at XYZ hotel. If they show back up, they'll be arrested. This can be done with employees. I'll touch more on that in a minute. I recently had to trespass a gentleman from a medical clinic. It was a specialty clinic. He wasn't happy with the service that he was getting, so he made some threats to the office staff. I talked earlier about that open line of communication and the trust with the employer. That employee went to her supervisor, and the supervisor squashed it right away and notified me. I called this guy, let him know he is no longer allowed at that clinic. If he needs emergency medical care, he can go to the emergency room. Otherwise, for this particular specialty, the nearest clinic, I believe, was in Missoula. He wasn't happy, but that's the situation. The next step would be to obtain a restraining order against the person if it does elevate to that level. It has to be issued by a judge in your jurisdiction. And what this means is there's no contact at all. A trespass just keeps them off the property. It doesn't prevent them from calling you, emailing, sending a carrier pigeon, anything like that to try and contact you. Whereas a restraining order does. They're not allowed to set foot on the property. They can't contact you in any way, shape, or form. So that's something you kind of have in your back pocket. If the trespass doesn't work and they continue to harass, you could look at a restraining order. Some tips for safer terminations. Fancy word for if you have to fire somebody. Assess that threat. If the subject meets the threshold, you can involve security and or law enforcement. Keep the meeting short. Don't engage in debates or arguments. Just get to the point. Take any threats that they make seriously and avoid embarrassing them. Let them leave with dignity. Maybe do it at the end of the day. Don't parade them past the coworkers as an example, because you're setting yourself up. Relocate other workers away from the meeting until the employee has left. For example, if you're going to, depending on the layout of your business, you're called into the manager's office and there's other adjoining offices, maybe send those employees on a coffee break while this happens. That way, if any violence does break out, you've minimized the number of people that are there. Alert security, if you have security there, and other employees that the worker is no longer employed and that they're not to return. Like I said before, sometimes we've had to let police officers go. We all know that they aren't supposed to be there. Make sure they get home safely. If this employee, for example, carpooled with another employee who is still employed, maybe you want to call them a cab or otherwise offer a way to get them home. Let's talk real quick on what I call the worst case scenario. To me, that would be an active shooter. As it said in my bio, I'm an instructor for the Run, Lock, Fight model, which is an active shooter response that was created by the Safariland Training Group. All of School District 5 has been trained in this. And as the name implies, here's your options. Run, right? If you hear shooting down the hallway, getting out of the building and away from it as far as you can is obviously your best bet. Depending on the layout, you may not be able to. So your next option would be to lock your door, barricade it with furniture, shut the lights off, and be quiet. Hopefully the shooting will stop. And if they are moving through the building, they'll bypass the locked door. And lastly would be to fight. Again, this is a last resort. But as you're trying to run to the door, all of a sudden you're confronted with the gunman, and now the fight is on. So it's not going to be pretty, but I would fight to the best of your ability and look for improvised weapons, things like that. Call 911 when you get a chance and give as much detailed info as you can. Suspect description, number of suspects if there's more than one. Last known location. Hey, we're in Costco and I last saw them in produce, something like that. Number of victims, if you think of it. And cooperate with law enforcement when they arrive. And what I mean by that is we aren't going to show up quiet. We're going to be coming in kicking doors. We're going to be yelling, see hands. And we want to make sure that you're not the suspect, so just comply with our commands. Let's talk about external violence real quick. Make sure the building and the parking lots are well lit. And install video cameras if you can. They don't have to be super state-of-the-art expensive cameras. They can be, places like Walmart, Costco, even Amazon. Some of the best footage that I've gotten recently on different cases was from those Ring doorbells. I'm not endorsed by them. I don't get paid for that, but they're pretty inexpensive and they actually get really good footage. So that's something to think about. Have cameras around the entrances and exits. Internal cameras around any reception areas, anywhere money is handled or kept. A lot of times visible cameras, that's enough of a deterrent for criminals to avoid it too. Back to lighting, if your employees come and go after dark, especially critical here in Montana with daylight savings, sometimes it's dark when you get to work and it's dark when you go home. Have your employees try to leave in pairs. And part of it's just situational awareness, being off your phone as you're walking to your car and paying attention to what's going on, but make sure that things are well lit. Don't follow a set schedule for bank deposits. Have policies and guidelines for handling cash. In college, I worked in a small bicycle shop, and every morning, like clockwork, the owner would take the bank deposit envelope and he'd walk to the bank. He'd stop for a coffee. And it's amazing to me, he was never mugged. So don't do that. Have a variance. Don't do it every day. And don't be so blatant about it, I suppose. You can even use a courier service or security service if you have large sums of cash. Something to consider. Make sure your windows and doors are in good working order. They can be easy access points for criminals to break in. And your employee comes into work and somebody's already in there as they broke in. That could lead to some issues. So make sure your building is secure as it can be. New locks can be a pretty easy fix. How do your employees access the building? Is it just keys, electronic or metal keys? Do you have passcodes? Do you have ID badges? Again, like I talked about with visitors. The bike shop, again, we only had 4 or 5 employees, so simple metal keys were fine. If you're at a large complex like KRMC or whatever it is, Logan Health now, Applied Materials, where you have a large complex, even the police department, we have ID badges and we have a key code to get in. Anytime an employee is let go, that key code gets changed. So think about that. All right, let's talk about loss prevention and theft. What is your company policy regarding theft intervention? And again, this is geared more towards small business, retail locations, things like that. There's a retail store in town that has basically a hands-off approach. They just write it off. They'll call us, hey, somebody stole these items. We just need a case report number and we're going to report it to insurance. That's about it. Other businesses in town, they won't prosecute or do anything up to a certain dollar amount. And there's some that take it as far as being a cage match. I've responded to a grocery store one time for a kid that was trying to steal some beer. The busboy tackled him, hockey shirted him, and when I got there, he was sitting on this poor kid. His cape was blowing in the wind, and he just really thought he was Batman. So you're setting yourself up for problems if you resort to anything physical like that. Had that kid gotten hurt, he could have sued the store, and it probably wasn't worth it over the 6-pack of beer. It's usually best to be a good witness. There's a large department store here in town that does an excellent job. They give a clothing description, a vehicle description, and a license plate, the direction of travel, description of the items that were taken. And then when we show up, we get a witness statement and video surveillance. It's pretty easy. They don't physically confront them. They'll stop them. Hey, I'm with security. You need to come with me. Usually they get pretty compliant people. If they take off running or push their way past, these employees are trained not to engage, but to provide that information. And that's enough for us to prosecute. Internal theft. So this would be theft by employees. Again, you want to provide us with surveillance footage, documentation of the loss, like a bookkeeping discrepancy, things like that. Don't talk about the case with other employees because you don't want the person to get a heads up. Don't deduct it from their paycheck. Hey, I saw you stole 2 boxes of paper clips and some pencils, so I've deducted $60 from your account. There's laws preventing that, and it becomes a civil problem. We can't try to prosecute them criminally at that point. If you're going to fire them, make sure you have their final check ready. Collect any company property like keys, badges, laptops. That way, once they leave, they're done. A couple of examples. One recently, there was a gal with a vending machine route. The numbers were coming up inconsistent, and they provided all the information. We showed up, and as soon as she was fired, she came with us and was prosecuted. So they kind of had their ducks in a row. We'll talk, I was going to go through this real quick with background checks. That website right there is the one to go to, Department of Justice mt.gov. That would be the one to go to. You can, general public, you can get arrest and prosecutor information for felony and misdemeanor charges, but it is a little bit limited. It's not going to have driving records. So if it is a driving job for a CDL or something like that, you can go through the motor vehicle division. There's two types of checks, a name-based check and a fingerprint check. And you can actually create an account with the criminal history online public record search. I think they pronounce it choppers, but you can start your own account and use that and pay for those checks. A couple things, a name-based one costs you $15. The federal fingerprint one is what they call a WIN. There's multiple states. It's a Western Identification Network. That one costs you $30. If you have questions, there's the state number at the bottom, which again is on that website. Let's talk about mask enforcement really quick. Businesses can still require masks. Okay, the mask policy is just like a no shirt, no shoes, no service thing. It is not a police or a legal issue. It only becomes a police issue if the subject refuses to leave, which is trespassing, or they become disorderly, which is disorderly conduct. We have had instances of this. There was one that made the news. It was a gentleman up in Whitefish that refused to leave a health club because he wouldn't put his mask on. He was not arrested for not wearing his mask. He was arrested for trespassing. He was asked to leave and failed to do so. MCA is the Montana Code annotated. Real quick, criminal trespass, as defined, a person commits criminal trespass if they knowingly enter or remain unlawfully on the premises of another. So again, sir, you need to leave or put your mask on. No, can't make me. Now they're trespassing. Now it becomes a legal issue. Disorderly conduct, if they disturb the peace by quarreling, challenging to fight, using threatening, profane, or abusive language. We've run into this with people refusing to put masks on, threatening this, oh yeah, what are you going to do if I don't put my mask on? Or they start using swear words, things like that. That becomes disorderly conduct. That does become a legal issue. One thing I wanted to touch on with assault, obviously assault is bodily injury, weapons, things like that. But letter D there is reasonable apprehension. You don't actually physically have to assault somebody, but if they are reasonably apprehensive, meaning they are in fear, they genuinely were in fear that you were going to hurt them, that could also be grounds for assault. All right, I think we have reached our Q&A.
A huge thank you to Officer Bain for gifting his time and sharing his expertise on this topic today. Following a few announcements, we will leave up his contact information in case you have any further questions or would like to request a copy of his slide presentation today. And now let's open it up for some Q&A. So again, we're asking you to type your questions into the chat box and we will address them as time allows. And Brian, Dennis, excuse me, one that we have here right off the bat is, what are the penalties for trespass and disorderly conduct?
So disorderly conduct, first time offense is a $205 fine. So that's a pretty expensive mask. And criminal trespass to property for your first offense is $400. Typically, they won't bring jail time, but any second or subsequent charges would actually land you probably a night or two in jail, as well as a fine.
So don't do that. And now we've got, how do I obtain a restraining order?
So I touched on that briefly. If you do need to get a restraining order against an employee or a customer that's been a problem, you have to go to the court in your jurisdiction. If your business is based out of Kalispell city limits, you can come to Kalispell City Court. If you're based out in the county, you'd go see Justice Court. Same thing with Whitefish or Columbia Falls municipalities. You'd go, there's a packet that you can fill out, detail exactly why you want that person, want a restraining order against them for threats, behaviors, things like that. Be sure to save any, like if you have text messages, voicemails of these threats, that's the kind of stuff that the judge wants to see, that helps to build your case. So you would go see those. When the judge grants it, an officer will go present it and issue that restraining order to the person, and then it's on file. At no cost to you, by the way.
Well, that's nice that you don't even have to pay for it. What types of workplace violence does KPD usually see here in Kalispell?
Again, we have seen, like the OSHA statistics said, a lot of it is the violence can just be verbal. We've seen an increase in that here recently. A lot of hotels I've had to respond to recently, and I think part of that has to do with the housing market. People stay a few nights in a hotel, then they're refusing to leave, or they're getting kicked out, or they've trashed the room, and then it turns into a verbal altercation with staff. Then we have to respond. So we've definitely seen an increase in that. We've also seen an increase in transient activity, and that tends to lead to, there have been some physical altercations, as well as a lot of verbal things. Various businesses calling us to trespass people. So have definitely seen an uptick in that.
So with that, then, what are 3 workplace violence prevention strategies that you can recommend a business follow?
Prevention strategies, again, like I said, I would start with prevention, background checks, checking backgrounds, checking references, so that you're hiring good people. And I know right now everybody's looking for help, but this isn't the time to slack off on those kinds of things. Having those policies and procedures in place so that there is no question. Document. That way, any policy violations, they've been documented. And then, like I said, open lines of communication, making sure that your employees feel safe. They know they can come to you with questions, with complaints, and they know that they'll be dealt with.
Great. So then, what is your suggestion for when an employee is not satisfied with your resolution to their issue?
For an employee?
Yes. So say they're getting dismissed, or even being put on some kind of a probation where they have a chance to improve yet, but they are just not cool with it.
Well, again, the policies are in place for that. If you've laid it out to them, these are the expectations. And if they fail to meet those, they need to know these are the consequences. If they want to take it, I mean, everybody has a boss. If they're not happy with their supervisor, they can go to their supervisor. But I think it's important, if those things are laid out in black and white, these are the expectations. This is the time frame that you've been given. And if you don't like that, there's the door, quite honestly.
Great. And maybe a less common situation, but let's say that a company has a vendor or outside distributor who comes in to the business regularly, but then they threaten the employees in there.
I would say you would contact, if it's a specific vendor. Again, other careers I've had, you have sales reps, things that come in. If it's an issue with that particular rep, I would get in touch with their parent company and log a complaint with them. Hey, this particular employee, when he shows up, this vendor, yeah, we love doing business with you, but he's been threatening our employees. Maybe he's harassed some of our female employees. I would file a formal complaint with that company and see how they address it. And again, your employees need to know that you have their back and that you're going to stick up for them. And if that doesn't get you a good resolution, I would consider whether or not to continue doing business with that vendor.
Great, thank you. So since we still have a little bit more time here, let's pick apart the mask situation just a little bit more. It seems like it's one of those topics that has a lot of volatility at times. And so for a business to protect themselves, how careful do they have to be about making sure that if they're requiring masks in their business, that they thoroughly enforce that? Whereas if they let somebody in who doesn't have a mask, and then they now have a complaining customer who is complying with the mask ordinance in their company, how strict do they need to be, or how concerned should they be about?
That's going to be up to the individual businesses. I know of a business in town that they are extremely strict, and I've never seen any variance. I've never seen any deviation from their policy. I think it needs to be an all or none, because as you point out, if they start picking and choosing who they're going to enforce, then they're going to start setting themselves up for a problem.
Fair enough. And one last call for anyone who would like to enter any questions in the chat box. Feel free. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and start wrapping things up here. And a quick reminder for those who have not reported their attendance yet to please enter your name, company name, job title, and city in the chat box. And thank you again to Officer Dennis Bain. And this will wrap up our 2021 Blueprint for Business Success Spring Series. We will take a 3-month summer hiatus and return in September with our fall lineup. As a reminder, there will be an anonymous 2-minute survey that pops up when you leave today. Your participation will help us improve this program and provide meaningful topics and content. Thank you for attending.